Those guys are a lot of fun. That's the Maccabees doing their version of Ma Nishtana. Everything that sounded like music, perhaps glasses playing or matzah crunching, was in fact made, the sound effects were made out of their mouths. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? By the way, Ma Nishtana, how is this night different from all other nights? That's a traditional melody that the youngest person at a Passover Seder would ask the 4 questions. How is this night different from all other nights? We ask on Passover. That's the first of 4 questions. Let's light up the darkness. All right, who is going to be with us as we get firmly into chapter 10 here in Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Passover. Until now, we've been studying lots of technical laws, many of them having to do with the Korban Pesach, bringing the Passover offering, an animal sacrifice that we have not been able to do in 2,000 years, more or less. Now, with this chapter 10, we're getting into the laws of the Seder itself, which we still do. So these laws will be very relevant to modern practice. Who's with us as we get it going on a Monday night? Pauline in Arkansas, Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehudis in South Carolina, Paul in Chicago, Nancy in North Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, James in Indy, Anne in Merced, Iridiancia in Indonesia, perhaps tuning in from the farthest away. Welcome. Bill Shalom from Berkeley. Probably going to have to watch most of it on rewatch later, but wanted to say hi at the start. Elsbieta in Des Moines, Washington. Rand in Des Moines, Washington. I didn't know there was a Des Moines in Washington. I thought it was in Iowa. Randy in Florida, Renee in Indy, Rochelle in Modesto. Steve says Erev Tova, good evening. Lindsay Adams saying Shalom Aleichem to Sal and Nina. PK saying good evening. Melissa in Great Neck. PK's in Colorado. Jill in Illinois. John in Memphis. Maria in Kentucky. Chaim in Charlotte. Welcome, everybody. Over there on the YouTube side, Neil in Virginia, Marjorie saying shalom from Georgia. Great to be with you. Let me get that set. Okay. We have a lot to do. This page 100, we're actually going to start it at near the bottom of page 99 on the B side. We read the first Mishna of chapter 10 yesterday. We're going to read it again. It's a short Mishna to set up for the rest of the page. I don't know that we've done this yet. We are going to be reading the whole page. The whole page is relevant. It's a relatively short page, so we can do it even with our time constraints because, we don't just read it. Obviously, there's going to be points to discuss, but today we can read the whole page, and though it is a short page, there's a lot to do. So let's get right into it. Mishnah. On the eve of Passover, adjacent to Mincha time. So Erev Pesach, the 14th of the Hebrew month of Nisan. Passover begins on the night of the 15th. Adjacent to Mincha time. When is Mincha? The time for saying the afternoon prayer. The greater Mincha, meaning the better time to say it, is at the earliest possible moment that you can make the afternoon prayer. Generally a good principle of mitzvahs. If the time is optional, it is preferable to do the mitzvah, to fulfill an obligation at the earliest possible time. But here we're actually talking about the lesser mincha, which is about the 9th hour. Some say the 9th and a half hour. So if the day was like the first day of spring, when there's 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night, so this would be from about 3:30 in the afternoon on. A person may not eat until dark. So on the afternoon before Passover begins, that night, a person may not eat until dark. Why? So that he will be able to eat matzah that night with a hearty appetite. Even the poorest of Jews, even the poorest of Jews should not eat the meal on Passover night until he reclines on his left side, as free and wealthy people recline when they eat. Get the picture in your mind, not of a family sitting in upright chairs around a table, but in ancient times, people of leisure would recline on their divan, on these kind of couches, with their own table brought before each of them, eating the food and having a long, long discussion into the night. So even the poorest of Jews should not eat the meal on Passover until he reclines on his left side, as free and wealthy people recline when they eat. And the distributors of charity should not give a poor person less than 4 cups of wine for the festival meal of Passover night. And this law, this halacha, applies even if the poor person is one of the poorest members of society and receives all of his food from the charity plate of the community. So even if this person is totally dependent on charity, nevertheless, on Passover night, he should have 4 cups of wine, a full 4 cups. And elsewhere we learn that even if a person is kind of like on the edge of poverty, and to get the 4 cups of wine for Passover, he has to sell some clothing, he should do it. It's that big a mitzvah. And we have a tradition that when you sacrifice for a mitzvah, God pays you in kind. When you really give up of yourself to fulfill an obligation, somehow, blessings will flow to you, and whatever clothes you sell will be replaced with even better ones. The Gemara expresses surprise at the Mishnah's statement that one may not eat on Passover Eve from the time that is adjacent to Mincha, the afternoon prayer. Why does this halacha, this law, why discuss this halacha, particularly with regard to the eves of Passover? Even on the eves of Shabbat and other festivals, it is also prohibited to eat in the late afternoon, as it was taught in a baraisa. Now, tonight we'll actually have a little bit of a discussion. We mention them all the time, and I always say to you, a baraisa was a teaching of the sages that was sort of codified contemporaneously with the Mishnah, but which is less authoritative than the Mishnah. Today we'll discuss that more, but for now, so it was taught in a baraisa. A person should not eat on the eves of Shabbos and festivals from Mincha time onward, so that he will enter Shabbos when he has a desire to eat and he will enjoy the Shabbos meal. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosei says one may continue eating until dark. He doesn't have to leave off from eating on the afternoon before Shabbos begins or before a festival begins. And this would seem to contradict what the Mishnah just said, that on Passover, from at least 3:30, the mid-afternoon onward, a person should not eat at all. So he reaches the meal and his Passover Seder with a hunger and a desire to eat the matzah that he's obligated to eat that night. Rav Huna said the Mishnah was necessary only according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, who said that one may continue eating until dark, right? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, you're not supposed to eat anyway, even before Shabbos. But according to Rabbi Yosei, who says whether it's Shabbos or Yom Tov or a festival, you can keep eating right up until the time it gets dark. Against his opinion, it would seem that we require this Mishnah that at least on Passover, we don't eat from mid-afternoon on. So Rav Huna is saying the Mishnah was necessary only according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, who said that one may continue eating until dark. According to his opinion, the Mishnah is necessary to emphasize that this applies only on the eves, meaning that daytime before Shabbos starts that night, on the eves of Shabbos and festivals. But on the eve of Passover, due to the obligation to eat matzah, Rabbi Yosei concedes that one must refrain from eating in the afternoon so that he will eat matzah with a good appetite. In a note, we learn that what Rabbi Yosei, if that is indeed the right way to understand Rabbi Yosei's opinion, then why does he distinguish Passover from all the other festivals and from Shabbos itself? Because Passover is the only time where there is a Torah, a written Torah obligation to eat at night, to eat that matzah at night, or to eat the Korban Pesach when the temple is standing and we can bring the Pesach. But even after the temple's destruction, we still have an obligation to eat matzah at night. There is no other Torah obligation to eat something at night. Now you might say, well, we have an obligation to recite Kiddush. We do have an obligation to recite Kiddush, right, to bring in Shabbos, to sanctify Shabbos. We sanctify Shabbos with the Shabbos evening Kiddush. But it could be done the next day if necessary. You should have a Shabbos dinner. You should have 3 meals at Shabbos. But if for some reason you can't have a Shabbos dinner on Friday night, you can still fulfill your obligation to eat 3 meals on Shabbos by having all 3 meals on Saturday day. But the absolute obligation to eat matzah on the night of Passover is absolute. And so Rabbi Yosei perhaps would say, okay, because we have to eat matzah, in that case, I would agree that we have to stop eating in the mid-afternoon before Passover begins, so that when we get to that matzah, we're in a state of anticipation and indeed hunger for it. Rav Papa said, even if you say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that we do have to stop eating before Shabbos as well, there is still a difference between the eves of Shabbos and other festivals as compared with the eve of Passover. There, on the eves of Shabbos and other festivals, it is only from mincha time onward that it is prohibited to eat. But adjacent to the mincha time, it is permitted. However, on the eve of Passover, even adjacent to mincha time, it is also prohibited to eat. And presumably, adjacent to mincha would be from the beginning of the 9th hour and onward. I'm not totally sure about what adjacent to means, but clearly it's earlier. And it's not necessarily from midday on. So it's something to do with that 9th hour. Rav Papa said, I'm sorry, I just read what Rav Papa said. It is prohibited, but adjacent to mincha time, it is permitted. However, on the eve of Passover, even adjacent to mincha time, it is also prohibited. For this reason, the Mishnah is referring specifically to the eve of Passover. Now, we're going to keep discussing what time, how we're to behave on the afternoon before Passover begins, and what we learn out from that about how we are to behave on the afternoon before Shabbos begins. Today's class is actually going to be more about Shabbos and there is a custom now to have a taste of Shabbos, right? A taste of the Shabbos dinner. Like for instance, like right before we go out to Friday evening services. That's quite late in the afternoon on Friday. So it seems that we do not follow this teaching of Rabbi Yehuda, and actually it seems like we follow Rabbi Yosei that we can eat all afternoon prior to Shabbos. But before we get into that discussion, let me just mention something about these 4 cups of wine. The Gemara will come back around and talk more about that, but not today. We'll come back maybe on page 101, 102. I haven't looked forward yet. But here, just with respect to the 4 cups mentioned in the Mishnah, there's a note that I want to read to you that Rav Steinsaltz included here. So the 4 cups. The Rashbam cites the idea that these 4 cups, why 4 cups? That's the question. Why do we have to have 4 cups of wine on Passover? What's so important about 4 cups? It's so important that, right, even a person who lives on charity, he too has to have 4 cups of wine, 4 full cups. So the Rashbam, the commentator, the Rashbam cites the idea that these 4 cups correspond to the 4 expressions of redemption And this is at Exodus 6, 6, and 7. I should have called that up in front of me. Let me see how fast I can get that verse right in front of me. Exodus 6. Here we go. 6, 6, and 7. Say therefore to the Israelite people, I am the Lord. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements of the Egyptians. And I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I, the Lord, am your God who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. So there, that you have these four expressions of being redeemed from Egypt and taken by God. I will free you, I will deliver you, I will redeem you, and I will take you to be my people. These are the words of God to the Jewish people. And so the 4 cups of wine come to be correlated with those 4 expressions of redemption. And here the Rashbam explains, I will bring you out, I will deliver you, I will redeem you, I will take you. The Meiri explains, another commentator, that each expression is referring to a different stage of the redemption. The phrase, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, is referring to the redemption from the actual physical slave labor. I will deliver you from their bondage speaks of the release of the Jewish people from the subjugation of a foreign power. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm alludes to how God will strike the enemies of the Jewish people and free them until they are even more powerful than their erstwhile masters. And I will take you to me for a people, and I will be to you a God, teaches that God will take the Jews as his people, his chosen people, and give them his Torah, chosen to receive the Torah. So there is where, so from those 4 expressions, Exodus 6, 6, and 7, we get these 4 expressions of redemption, of God personally reaching out and taking the Jewish people out of slavery and making us free, and setting us up to be a powerful people and one who receives the Torah, is why we have the 4 cups of wine at the Seder. They're symbolic of those 4 aspects of the redemption. The Gemara asks, and on the eve of Shabbat, adjacent to Mincha time, is it permitted to eat? But wasn't the following taught in a Baraisa? A person may not eat on the eve of Shabbos and festivals from 9 hours and onward, right? So on a day that's 12 hours day, 12 hours night, like in the first day of spring, and Passover is close to the first day of spring, a person may not eat on the eve of Shabbos and festivals from the 9th hour onward, which would be like from 3 p.m., so that he will enter Shabbos when he is filled with the desire to eat. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosei says one may continue eating until dark. According to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, even on Shabbos Eve, one may not eat from before the time of the lesser mincha. The lesser mincha is the later mincha, right? The later mincha is about 3:30. The greater mincha, that's the lesser mincha. The greater mincha would be to do it at the first opportunity, which is about 12:30 in the afternoon. Excuse me. Mar Zutra said, who will say... So one may continue eating until dark. According to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, even on Shabbos Eve, one may not eat from the time of the lesser mincha, which is at 9.5 hours of the day, so about 3:30 in the afternoon. Mar Zutra said, who will say to us that this version of the Baraisa is accurate? Perhaps this Baraisa is corrupted, and therefore it cannot serve as the basis of an objection. Right, so here we're getting that clear distinction between the Mishnah and the Baraisa. Right, so the Mishnah was a set of oral teachings, by no means exhaustive of the oral law or of the oral tradition. It was like the key concepts of the oral tradition as it existed at the time that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, decided that the Roman oppression had become so severe that if we don't write down at least the key points of the oral law, it's possible that all of the rabbis whose job it is to have memorized the entire oral law will be killed. They'll be martyred and killed, and then the Jewish people will lose the oral law forever. So lest that come to happen, Rebbe said we're going to write down at least the Mishnah. And so which teachings qualify to be in the Mishnah? I mean, he's the one who finally set it down and codified it. It's a project that really began with Rabbi Akiva and with Rabbi Meir, who said, okay, which ones qualify to be the Mishnah? The Mishnah. This is the Mishnah. And they were, carefully scrutinized. And they were all memorized oral teachings, but they're the ones who qualified as the Mishnah. Here the note says, the sages were familiar with many baraisas. Some were organized into collections, while others were isolated statements. Since most baraisas were not carefully reviewed for accuracy, only a few collections of baraisas were universally accepted as reliable. For example, those taught in the academies of Rabbi Chiya and Rabbi Oshaya. All other baraisas were suspected of inaccuracies or imprecise formulations. And that's why when we have some kind of a contradiction between a baraisa and a Mishnah, we're always going to look to the Mishnah as the more authoritative source for the oral tradition, which began at Mount Sinai and was passed down through Joshua to the elders, to the judges, to the prophets, to the men of the great assembly, to the sages themselves. So Maremar said to him, to Mar Zutra, who questioned the accuracy of this baraisa, and some say it was Rav Yemar, I happened to come to the festival lecture of Rav Pinchas, the son of Rav Ami, and the Tana, who recited Mishnayos, stood up and taught this baraisa before him, and he accepted it. Right? So they had a tradition of this particular baraisa, which says, right, that Rav Yehuda says that like on Shabbos and festivals, on the eve before Shabbos or the festival begins, from the mid-afternoon onward, no eating. Whereas Rabbi Yosei says you can keep eating. So that baraisa now is going to be deemed to be an accurate baraisa. All right, so then what? So this incident proves that the above version of the baraisa is accepted and considered accurate. If so, the aforementioned objection to Rav Papa's opinion on the basis of the baraisa remains difficult. Rather, Rav Papa's answer is insufficient, and it is clear that the Mishnah must be understood in accordance with the explanation of Rav Huna. In other words, the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, who maintains that although one may eat until dark on the eves of Shabbos and other festivals, it is prohibited to eat on the eve of Passover from shortly before the lesser mincha, so about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or maybe 3:30, until nightfall. The Gemara asks, and according to the explanation of Rav Huna, does it work out well? We still have a problem. But didn't Rabbi Yirmiyah say that Rabbi Yochanan said, and some say that Rabbi Abahu said, that Rabbi Yosei bar Rabbi Hanina said, the halacha, the law, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda with regard to the eve of Passover, and the halacha, the law, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei with regard to the eve of Shabbos. Now, the Gemara infers from the above statement, from the fact that it was necessary to say that the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda with regard to Erev Pesach, the eve of Passover, this proves by inference that Rabbi Yosei disagrees with regard to both cases, both the eves of Shabbos and other festivals, as well as Passover Eve. Consequently, it is impossible to ascribe to the opinion of Rabbi Yosei the Mishnah's prohibition against eating on the eve of Passover, as he evidently permits one to eat until dark, even on Passover Eve. The Gemara answers, no. The statement should be understood like this. When it was said that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, This proves by inference that they disagree with regard to something else. Not from what time must you stop eating and whether you must stop eating or not, but rather with regard to the issue of interruption. Interruption refers to what if you sat down to a meal because you were with your fellow sages having very interesting conversations about Torah. You've been doing it all day. You started eating early in the afternoon on Friday before Shabbos or in the afternoon before a festival starts. And then you keep talking and talking and talking. Without you even noticing, it gets dark. So now Shabbos started. So, and this food is already before you. You're already involved in a meal. Do you just keep eating and think of this as your Shabbos dinner? Or do you interrupt? Do you even perhaps remove all the food that's in front of you and reset the table and bring out the wine for Kiddush and bread for Motzi and a whole new meal? So it's because now Shabbos has begun or a festival has begun. Or since you're already eating, you just keep eating and you don't have to interrupt. This also is a point of dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei, as we shall see. As it was taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei disagree about interrupting a meal. If people were eating on the eve of Shabbos, they must interrupt for the beginning of Shabbos, meaning that once Shabbos begins, they must interrupt their meal, clear away the table, and recite the evening prayers and Kiddush to sanctify Shabbos, Kiddush over wine, before continuing their meal. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosei says the diners, the people eating this meal, need not interrupt their meal just because Shabbos began. The Baraisa continues by relating a story. And there was an incident, very colorful story we're getting into here. Let me make an adjustment. And there was an incident involving Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, so the Nasi, the chief rabbi, the head of the Sanhedrin, and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei, who were reclining and eating together in Akko on Friday afternoon, right? So Akko, that's right there near modern day Tel Aviv, but Akko's an ancient city. And the day of Shabbos was sanctified. In other words, Shabbos began. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said to Rabbi Yosei, Berabi, a title for an important man of distinguished lineage, which is like, I'm going to call you by the most flattering title I can, because now I'm going to ask you a difficult question. Berabi, is it your will that we should interrupt and be concerned for the statements of our colleague Yehuda, who's sitting right there, who maintains that one is obligated to interrupt his meal, right? So you've got a dinner now that includes the chief rabbi and the two rabbis who are known to have a passionate dispute about this halakhic issue, this legal issue in Jewish law. Do we, when we happen to be eating a dinner before Shabbos starts and then Shabbos begins, do we interrupt that meal or not? Rabbi Yosei says we don't interrupt it. Rabbi Yehuda says we do. Rabban Gamliel hasn't said who he's following. He simply asked Rabbi Yosei, given that Rabbi Yehuda is right here, shall we interrupt the meal out of concern for him? Because he certainly would want to interrupt the meal. Rabbi Yosei became a little testy. Rabbi Yosei said to him, to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, each and every day you cherish my statements before those of Rabbi Yehuda. Right, so it's not just that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei disagree. It's essentially that Rabbi Yehuda's is the minority opinion. It's one-on-one, but we've learned this before, that in one-on-one disputes, Rabbi Yosei wins because Rabbi Yosei was known to be one who, just has absolute like photographic memory, perfect recall, and just a huge, huge computer-like brain that has absorbed all of the tradition that's been received up until that age in Jewish history. Jewish history was already 1,200 years old, more. So Rabbi Yosei knows it. So if Rabbi Yosei says it's like this, we can rely on Rabbi Yosei. Rabbi Yehuda can disagree. He has reasons to disagree, but basically the law follows Rabbi Yosei when he's in a one-on-one dispute with any other sage. So Rabbi Yosei is like, what are you doing? We have a principle. Me against Yehuda, you follow my version of the law. Why are you questioning that right now? Right? So each and every day you cherish my statements before those of Rabbi Yehuda, and you rule in accordance with my opinion. And now you cherish the statement of Rabbi Yehuda before me? Rabbi Yosei continued by applying a verse to this situation. Very timely, considering that we just celebrated Purim on Friday, and in Jerusalem they celebrated Shushan Purim the next day. And it's a 2-day holiday, so it was Purim in Jerusalem even up through yesterday on Sunday. So it's a line from the book of Esther. So he quotes Achashverosh, right, the king in the Esther story, who says at Esther chapter 7 verse 8, will he, meaning the evil Haman, even ravish the queen before me in my house? Right? So in that moment when Esther finally reveals that she's a Jew and that Haman, who has been bribing the king and pushing his agenda to have all of the Jewish people murdered on the same day, which fell out in the calendar, it would be the day of Purim, that he wanted, or the day before Purim, that he wanted all the Jews in the world to be murdered, and Esther happens to be a Jew, and then she informs the king that somebody is trying to kill the queen and all her people, and the king said, who is that? And she said, Haman, because I'm a Jew and he's trying to kill all the Jews in the world. And the king is like, what? I didn't realize. That's terrible. I would never have agreed to that if I knew that it was you and your people. And he's so angry that he storms out of the room. Now Haman realizes that he's in deep doo-doo and he starts begging the queen to have mercy on him and to not have him executed, which is the natural result when you try to attack the king or queen. And in his passion to save his own life, he falls at her feet and he's like actually clutching at her clothes and begging her to have mercy on him. And the king walks in at that moment, and it looks like Haman is accosting the queen, and who knows in what precise manner he's accosting her from the king's point of view. So will he even ravish the queen in my presence? That's where the story ends. So we'll continue what the later sages say about the story. But before we do, what is Rabbi Yosei saying, right? So every day you listen, you take my opinion over Yehuda, okay. And now, when I'm here and he's here and you say, well, because he's here, maybe we should defer and be thoughtful about his view of the law. But what about me? I'm here too. Are you not going to be thoughtful about my view of the law, which normally is the prevailing view of the law? And then he cites this line from the book of Esther saying, and will he ravish the queen even before me? Now, it could simply mean, and will you make such an offensive gesture right in front of me? Maybe leave it at that. But if we actually take it a little further, will he ravish the queen? Because, when a sage brings in a verse, he has the full sense of the verse at his disposal. These guys had the entire Bible absolutely memorized. In fact, that was easy for them to memorize every line of the Bible. They also had every line of the Talmud memorized, right? Or at least every line of the Mishna, a much bigger compendium. So what exactly did it mean? Who is the queen that is being ravished? So certain, some thoughts have been put forward over the centuries. Who did he mean? The queen might be the Shekhinah, right? The divine presence, which is normally ascribed a female gender, right? The Shekhinah is that aspect of God is everywhere. We're in God. The whole universe is inside God and a tiny little part of God since God is infinite. But what the Shekhinah is that aspect of God which God allows to be revealed in this world. So whenever you feel like you're having a transcendent, holy moment, you're having a holy experience, that's the Shekhinah, right? And we've learned this before, that when two or more gather together, and certainly if 3 or 10 gather together and are sharing a meal and they're talking Torah, then the divine presence rests on them, right? So here Rabbi Yosei might be saying, we've been establishing the law. That has been our project as the sages for centuries. And we've all come to the conclusion that when there's a matter of law, a matter of dispute, and it's whether my version of it will prevail over another sage, one-on-one, we've said Rabbi Yosei's view prevails. And now just to be good manners, to have a little bit of etiquette toward Yehuda, you're going to challenge an actual halacha, right? You're going to challenge the way that I brought it down, which we accept as the law, not just a matter of politeness. That's actually like ravishing the queen. And on this question, by the way, it's worth remembering, halacha versus etiquette. This came up not long ago, actually, in our own minyan. We had a little issue that there were people talking. People were chatting when other people were praying, and it was disturbing the people who were praying. So I actually went to a big dayan, a gadol, a big rabbi whose views, who people go to him to ask questions of halacha, because he really just knows it all. That's Rabbi Tauber, Elchanan Tauber here in LA, is one of these great rabbis that you can go to for questions of law. And I said to him, with regard to people talking in shul during services, if I ask them to be quiet, is that a matter of etiquette or a matter of halacha? And Rabbi Tauber said, halacha. Simple answer. No elaboration necessary. That's a matter of halacha. Now, in practice, that can be a little awkward. I mean, everybody has a desire. They see their friends they don't normally see. It's Friday night, services. They're happy to see each other. They're going to greet them. Okay, fine. But then they start to get chatty. And it's like, I have to walk over there and shush them. I'm uncomfortable shushing them. But it's not just etiquette. It's not just manners. Of course, there's polite ways to say it. Great. But it's not. But the reason for going over there and asking them to be quiet is not just so that they would politely be quiet so that we can focus on our prayers. It's halacha. It's law, right? And so on a matter of law, there we have to be much more brave and forward. And, if it's time to issue a rebuke, we issue the rebuke. All right. So that's why Rabbi Yosei, it's not just he was saying, hey, man, listen to me. I'm more important. He was defending the honor of Torah in the presence of God, as it were, the Shekhinah resting over this table where they're discussing Torah, and he's like defending the honor of God who wants us to do God's will at all times, as the sages have laid it out. Let's continue. So Rabban Shimon said to him about this story, if displaying concern for Rabbi Yehuda's opinion will be viewed as, Rabbi Shimon was there. So Rabbi Shimon said to him, we haven't mentioned Rabbi Shimon yet, but the stories continue. So Rabbi Shimon said to him, to Rabbi Yosei, if displaying concern for Rabbi Yehuda's opinion will be viewed as a halachic ruling, we will not interrupt, as perhaps the students will see that we have broken off our meal and will establish the halacha, the law, for generations to come in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Shimon's making the same point. If by interrupting just to, for the sake of Rabbi Yehuda, so we can placate him because he would like to interrupt because that's the way he views this law, that would be like as a matter of courtesy. But if the fact that we sages are gathered here, and now that you've raised this point, if we were still to interrupt, the students might remember that we must interrupt, and that is not the law, and we don't want the law to be set down inaccurately, and then for generations to come, they're going to get it wrong. We have a huge responsibility here. We're not just guys, observing the law, where the sages sort of setting down, revealing the law as it's been given and handed down through the generations. So the sages later said they did not move from there until they established the halacha in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei. And one need not interrupt one's meal on the eve of Shabbos and festivals. So if you've started the meal, and then it becomes Shabbos, according to Rabbi Yosei, and that's how they established the law, you need not interrupt the meal. Right? Wrong. They did establish the law that way, and they were Tanaim, rabbis of the Mishnaic period. And generally, the way the rabbis, the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishna and earlier established the law is the law for all time. And the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Talmud, right, the rabbis of the Gemara period, the next set of commentaries on the Mishnah, like from the year 200 to the year 500, the Common Era, they never overrule the Tanaim, except in some rare instances like this one. Rav Yehuda, not Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Yehuda is later. Rabbi Yehuda was a Tana teaching in Israel. Rav Yehuda is an Amora teaching in Bavel, in Babylonia, and he's a contemporary of Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said the halacha is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who said that one must interrupt one's meal by removing the table entirely. Nor is it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, who ruled that one need not interrupt one's meal at all. Rather, one must spread a cloth over one's table, covering up the food, and recite Kiddush, after which he may continue his meal. And the Gemara asks, is that so? But didn't Rav Tahalifa bar Avdimi say that Shmuel said, just as one interrupts for Kiddush, so one interrupts for Havdalah. People eating a meal on Shabbos until nightfall must interrupt their meal to recite Havdalah. And the Gemara inquires, what is the meaning of one interrupts? Is it not referring to removing the table? And the Gemara answers, no, it is referring to spreading a cloth, which is sufficient for both when Shabbos starts and when Shabbos ends at Havdalah. So before I go on, now this can start to sound a little familiar to us. Okay, so they're having a meal. It becomes Shabbos. Rabbi Yosei said, just keep eating. Rabbi Yehuda said, stop, clear away the table, do the evening prayers, then bring in the wine, make the Kiddush, sanctify Shabbos, then bring the food back or bring in new food. And then Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, the law is not like either one of those. Rather, we leave the food there, but we cover it. We cover it. And some say that this is the source for why we cover the challah at the Friday night dinner while we are reciting the Kiddush to sanctify Shabbos at our Shabbos dinner tables. That is not a universally accepted idea either, right? Some say that this is the source of covering the challah, right? So at a Shabbos dinner, whenever you go to a Shabbos dinner, when you get there, right, the challah is out on the table, but it is covered with a challah cover. And then we recite the Kiddush, then we wash our hands, then we come back and we make a blessing over the bread, and then we eat the bread. And of course, as we've learned before, it's eating the bread that makes a meal a meal. A meal without bread is a snack, right? The way the sages understand it. However, this idea of the challah cover, maybe it comes from this idea that we would interrupt if we were already eating, maybe. But others say, and the majority of the views say, that no, the reason we cover the challah is one of two other reasons. Either it's because, as we've seen, what makes a meal a meal? The bread. The bread is always paramount. It represents God's sustenance of us, right? The wine we drink, it's a holy ritual, and we sanctify the day with it. But whenever we have to say a blessing over foods in front of us, if there's bread, the bread is the most important food. And yet we want to sanctify Shabbos by saying Kiddush. So we're going to say a blessing over the wine first. Since the bread is right there, and normally the bread takes precedence, we cover the bread so that the bread will not be humiliated, as it were. And if we are so careful not to humiliate an inanimate object like bread, how much more so should we be careful not to ever humiliate a human being? That's one explanation of why we cover the challah. The other explanation is that it reminds us of when we were entirely in God's hands and all our sustenance derived directly from God, namely when all the children of Israel were wandering in the desert and we ate manna each day. The fact is, every day we receive all of our sustenance from the Lord, but we don't always remember that. At our Shabbos table, we want to remember that. So why is the bread covered? Because when we lift the challah board, and so at our table, right, when it's time to make the motzi, to make the blessing over the bread, it's covered. First we say, Posech es yadecha masbia lechol chai ratzon. You open your hand and satisfy the desire of every living thing. That's a line from Psalm 145. We actually open our hands and we say that, right, to remind us that we receive everything from God. Then I, as the leader at our table, lift the challah board. So it's a cutting board, like a wood cutting board. The challah is on top of that, and the challah cover is over the bread. So we have three layers: the cover, the bread, and then the challah board. And this reminds us of the manna that we ate in the desert, which was preserved from coming into contact with anything that might disrupt its purity. It wasn't touched by animals or ants or bugs or scorpions or snakes or dirt or anything. Why? Because it was on a layer of frost, and then the manna, and then a layer of dew over it. And it was entirely protected from the elements. And there we picked up the manna and we received our sustenance from God, not only giving us what we need to eat, but giving it to us in a beautiful presentation, as it were. All right, let me continue. But didn't Rav Tahalifa about Havdalah? And so then the Gemara relates. Rabba, and we're almost done, so if you have questions, put them in. The Gemara relates, Rabba bar Rav Huna happened to come to the house of the exilarch. So now we're in Bavel, in Babylonia. The exilarch is the head of the Jewish community in Babylonia. And Rabba bar Rav Huna happened to come to the house of the exilarch. And his hosts were reclining for a meal. And the attendants, why were they reclining? It wasn't necessarily Passover, but the exilarch was a person of tremendous wealth and importance. He was actually third in line for the Persian throne, right? Babylonia was part of the Persian Empire at that time, and he was actually considered to be third in line for the throne, which happened once. There was a Jew who was like the king of Persia for, I don't know, like a day or something. And of course, Queen Esther was the queen of Persia. But let me continue. His hosts were reclining for a meal, and the attendants brought a table before him so he could eat as well, right? So again, we don't have that image of people sitting up around a table, rather reclining on a divan with private tables. Each person has one in front of him. So the attendants brought a table before him so he could eat as well. Now, since Shabbat had already started, he spread a cloth over the food and he recited Kiddush. And that was also taught in a Baraisa. And the sages agree that one may bring the table only if he has already recited Kiddush. And if one brought out the table before Kiddush, he should spread a cloth over the food and recite Kiddush. It was taught in one Baraisa, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei, who disagree over whether it is permitted to eat from mincha time on Shabbos Eve and whether one must interrupt his meal, agree that one may not begin a meal from this time. And it was taught in the other Baraisa that they agree that one may begin the meal. And so the Gemara explains, granted, that which was taught in the first Baraisa, that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei agree that one may not begin a meal, you will find that this is correct with regard to the eve of Passover, as even Rabbi Yosei concedes that one may not start a meal on Passover ab initio. right? So now we're getting back to Passover and this idea that from afternoon onward, you don't want to eat food. You don't want to at least you don't want to start a whole meal. So that you'll still be hungry when the time to eat the matzah comes. However, with regard to the other baraisa, which taught that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei agree that one may begin, when does this halacha apply? If we say it's referring to the eve of Shabbos, this cannot be the case, as it was taught that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei indeed disagree over whether one may start a meal at that time. And the Gemara answers, it is not difficult. Here, the baraisa in which Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei agree that it is permitted to start a meal is referring to before 9 hours, before 3 o'clock, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Then, okay, you can start a meal. It's like a late lunch. But once we get into mid-afternoon and onward, okay, Rabbi Yosei would let you keep eating, although even he would agree that you don't do that on Passover. Rabbi Yehuda would say you should stop eating so that you at least, even if it's not Passover, you should enter Shabbos or any other festival with some hunger. And what is the law with respect to Passover? It is prohibited to eat on Passover Eve from shortly before the time of the lesser, i.e. the later mincha, afternoon prayers, from the end of the 9th hour of the day until nightfall. And some authorities state that one should be stringent and not eat bread after midday, the time of the greater, i.e. the earlier mincha, the earlier afternoon prayer. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let me come to your questions and comments. Nina's telling me no questions, but a comment from Sharon. I am teaching a class called Pesach by the Numbers. While the 4 expressions of redemption is the most commonly known, there is also, this is about with respect to why we have 4 cups of wine, why it's so important for every Jew to have 4 cups of wine at Pesach, at Passover. So says Sharon, there is also a reference to the restoration from the 4 corners of the earth, the 4 matriarchs, understanding that they perpetuate Jewish life. I'm sorry, now that I've refreshed, there is a question. But hold on. So I love this idea from Sharon that the 4 cups refer not only, as we said, the 4 expressions of God taking us out of Egypt and redeeming us and freeing us and taking us to Him to be a people who would receive the Torah, but also that it could refer to the ingathering of exiles, that eventually we will all be brought back to the Holy Land from the 4 corners of the earth. Or there's 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but there's 4 matriarchs, right? So that's Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And so whenever we have the number 4, it is going to remind us about the 4 matriarchs. And of course, the secret of Jewish continuity is always with the mom, right? The level of Jewishness in the home is set by the mom. We all owe it to our moms. Neil asks, does it matter if the challah for Shabbos is a full loaf, or can it be, if the meal had already begun, half a loaf? Great question. It is definitely preferable to have a whole loaf. And we encountered that earlier. So that's preferable. And so that's why we have Shabbos loaves, right? So like those mini challahs, which it's a small amount of bread, much smaller than half of a whole challah, but it's whole, right? And so it is better, if possible, to have 2 whole loaves that haven't been cut. If that's not possible, okay, so then you could use the half loaf. But it would be better to use 2 whole loaves, even if they are small. Why 2? Because they remind us that we were in God's hands in the desert, receiving all of our sustenance from God. On Friday, we received the double portion of manna so that we wouldn't have to go out and gather on Shabbos. And that's symbolized with the 2 loaves. Yosef says, yes, no embarrassing the challah, LOL. Neither do we embarrass each other. Absolutely. As I mentioned. And Sharon says, the not embarrassing of the challah was a teaching that really impacted my kids when our rabbi taught them that. It was an impactful lesson to them on the importance of sensitivity, even as young children. And so having both of you mention it, Yosef and Sharon, we'll just repeat it one more time, right? It's the bread that makes a meal, So whenever we have a choice of, we don't have to say a blessing over every food on the table. If there's bread on the table, okay, we bless the bread, and that bread includes everything. So if there is bread on the table, we always bless the bread, and we start with that. But since we want to bless the wine first in order to make a kiddush, it's like we're going to ignore the bread's prominence, and that would be embarrassing to the bread. Like there's something wrong with the bread, and suddenly we're not making the blessing over the bread that is due to the bread. People will wonder, oh, is there something wrong with that bread? And so that the bread won't be embarrassed when we bless the wine first, there's a cover on the bread. As I said, that's one of the two explanations. The other is reminiscing of the manna between the layers that God presented it with, the dew and the frost. But if we're going to be careful not to embarrass a loaf of bread, how much more must we be always careful not to embarrass or humiliate any human being in a public setting? If somebody needs to be corrected or rebuked, we do it privately. That's what I've got for us tonight. It's been great learning with you. These are very important teachings, and we're going to have a lot more of them from now until the end of the tractate. We're on page 100. The tractate ends on page 121, so we've got 3 weeks worth of these teachings here in chapter 10 pertaining to the Seder, the evening teachings that are still resounding to us today. And then it's going to be about a week or even less before Passover itself begins. And actually, when we reach the very last day, we're not going to make our siyum on page 121. We'll just pause and leave like the last paragraph or two. Why? And then we'll just go into the next tractate, which is Shekalim, and we'll postpone our siyum, our celebration ceremony of completing a tractate of study until the morning before the morning of Erev Pesach, the morning of the 14th of Nisan. Why? Because on that day, there is a fast of the firstborn, right? So the firstborn male Jews have to fast that day, but because it is sort of one of the most minor fasts, there's some flexibility with it. And if somebody is celebrating a siyum, a completion of study of some subject in Torah, some volume of Torah, like Tractate Pesachim, then we can make our siyum, make the brachas, the blessings over completing that tractate, and then we have to have a little celebratory meal, and that overrules the fast day of the firstborn. So then we don't have to fast on that day. I would have had to fast otherwise since I'm a firstborn. All right, that's a little preview of what is to come. Have a great night.